Chapter 15, the Autonomic Nervous System, Screencast 1. This first screencast will actually act as an introduction to the autonomic nervous system. When we look at the autonomic nervous system, we also want to compare it to the somatic nervous system. Remember, when we look at the somatic nervous system, that is one that we consider to be under conscious control. If we look at sensory, that is going to be those components that detect signals from special senses, so taste, vision, hearing, etc. The motor portion is responsible for sending signals from the central nervous system to the skeletal muscles. This is going to result in the initiation of voluntary movements, but we'll also be looking at reflexive movements that involve the brainstem and spinal cord. So keep in mind, the somatic nervous system is what we actually have capable control over, and the effector, the output, is actually going to be skeletal muscle. The autonomic nervous system, on the other hand, quite often will be referred to as the visceral motor system. Remember, when we see the term visceral, we think body. And what we're going to see here, in contrast to the somatic nervous system, we're looking at something that we have no conscious control over. So we're going to see signals that are coming from the central nervous system, and the target will be smooth muscle, glands, heart, etc. Now, keep in mind, sensory neurons, or that input, is not considered to be part of the autonomic nervous system. Visceral sensory input would be CO2 levels, oxygen levels, any stretch per se as far as a baroreceptor, those types of things. Now, when we look at the underlying function of the autonomic nervous system, it's all about maintaining homeostasis. So it is important to understand the autonomic nervous system, as in AMP2, our focus is all of the homeostatic systems. So an understanding of the autonomic nervous system is going to be critical. Now, here we're basically looking at an example that is comparing the somatic nervous system to the autonomic nervous system. And there are a couple of things that I want to point out that I think are especially important when we are looking at both of these. We're focusing on the motor system, so what I want to look at here is look at the output. And when we follow the track of the output, or that somatic motor neuron, notice it's just a single neuron. There's nothing in between. That's going to be important. So the goal here is to transmit information to skeletal muscle that's going to have that to actually contract. Now, when we look at the autonomic nervous system, I want to point out a couple of things when we look at the output in particular. So notice, instead of having a single neuron going from the central nervous system to the target, there are actually going to be two. We are going to see a preganglionic neuron, and then we are going to see a postganglionic neuron, which actually is going to be responsible for innervating the target. In this case, we're looking at the smooth muscle in the bronchioles of the lungs. Now, when we look at the lower motor neuron, once again, we have that single lower motor neuron in the somatic system. You're going to have the cell body, which is within the brainstem or spinal cord. And we're really looking at myelinated axons, so there's going to be a relatively fast conduction velocity. The other thing to keep in mind here is what neurotransmitter is going to be released by a lower motor neuron, and that is going to be acetylcholine, and it is going to have an excitatory effect on the target to contract the muscle fiber. When we look at the lower motor neuron of the autonomic nervous system, it's a chain of two motor neurons that are going to reach the effector. The first is the preganglionic neuron, and the cell body here is within the brainstem or spinal cord. It is going to release acetylcholine, and that will be responsible for activating the postganglionic neuron. Here, when we talk about ganglion, remember that is a term for a cell body. So the cell body here is within the autonomic nervous system, and this is going to release acetylcholine or norepinephrine epinephrine based on the branch of the autonomic nervous system, and the impact will be excitatory or inhibitory based on the receptor. Here we can actually see a visual of this system. So there is the preganglionic neuron cell body. We have that preganglionic neuron, so notice it's a myelinated neuron. And then we have the ganglionic neuron cell body. So here we're going to find a nicotinic receptor. We'll talk more about these later, but for now I want to introduce the fact that nicotinic receptors are going to be excitatory. That is the only way in which we can get the signal from the preganglionic neuron to the postganglionic neuron and eventually to the target. When we look at the postganglionic neuron, the neurotransmitter that will be released is based on whether or not it is a parasympathetic or sympathetic neuron. We'll address more of that in future screencasts. But once again, the target of the autonomic nervous system is always going to be some organ. Here, they're actually illustrating the small intestine being innervated by that postganglionic axon. Now, when we look at how the central nervous system is involved with the autonomic nervous system, the first area we need to address is going to be the hypothalamus. We want to think of the hypothalamus as the control and integration center for autonomic functions. It has other functions as you studied previously in AMP1, but we're going to focus on the relationship between the hypothalamus and the autonomic nervous system. In the next chapter that we cover, we're also going to see the role of the hypothalamus as it relates to the endocrine system. So let's think of the hypothalamus as the bridge kind of connecting the two control systems we have within our body, the nervous system and the endocrine system. When we look at the brainstem, remember we are now looking at lower level, and this is going to be an area where we have major autonomic nervous system reflex centers. In the spinal cord, we're also going to be looking at autonomic nervous system reflex centers, but they are going to be focused primarily on defecation and urination, two reflexes that originate at the level of the spinal cord.